So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Yaella Depietri. It's okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yaella earned her PhD in Environmental Sciences at the Institute of Science and Technology, Autonomous University of Barcelona, Spain. You'll have to tell me what the autonomous means in that, which she carried out jointly with the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security in Bonn, Germany, in January 2015. During her PhD, she worked at the MOVE EU-funded project on developing methods for the improvement of vulnerability assessment in Europe. She focused on conceptualizing and integrating the ecological dimension in the assessment of risk and vulnerability of urban areas to natural hazards. She then was a postdoctoral researcher at the New School in New York City for 2 years, working on different aspects of risk and vulnerability of the city to natural hazards, including heat waves, inland floods, and coastal storms. Very appropriate for now. She's now a ZEF postdoctoral fellow at the Technion Israel Institute of Technology with Professor Daniel Orenstein. Her research focuses on forest fires which affected the Carmel and the Haifa region in 2010 and 2016. Overall, she co-wrote various articles and book chapters on ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction and the role of nature-based solutions to adapt cities to extreme weather and climatic events. Her research interests reside on better understanding of how ecosystems and their services play a role in the shaping of the vulnerability of urban communities to natural hazards, in exploring the trade-offs between cultural and regulating services and how this might shape risk. And right now, she's going to talk about forest fire risk reduction towards an integrated forest management approach in Haifa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Thanks for coming. So yes, I've been working during my postdoc at the Technion on fire risk, mainly focusing on the city of Haifa. And despite, the title of my presentation is quite broad, so we are talking about forest fire risk reduction toward an integrated fire management approach. I just want to start saying that what you should not expect from this talk is to go into the detail of ecological or technical knowledge about fire risk, but more looking at social aspects, cultural aspects, and values about fire risk reduction. If we look at the world situation now, of course what is happening in Australia at the moment is telling us that we have our work, it goes well beyond our national boundaries. We have a very much more flammable world, let's say, that it's depicting, we see with the scene of these days. And so it becomes more urgent to strengthen and develop an integrated approach to fire risk reduction. Beyond, there are different drivers of risk that are defining a new also type of risk that we are facing nowadays in terms of fire risk, which is more concentrating at the boundaries between wildland and urban areas. So it's a type of risk that is kind of new, and we're also going to address a little bit, trying to develop more conceptually how to address this new type of risk. If we look at the drivers of risk, we see that this catastrophic fire risk is increasing, and mainly it's due to four main drivers. One of these is the expansion of urban areas, the increased demand of recreational activities, and the widespread use of fire exclusion practices, and land abandonment and conservation. When we look at these drivers of risk, which are concentrating risk particularly at the wild and urban interface, we see that these can be linked to different cultures and different values. That can be of different type, let's say socioeconomic or political or biophysical, but especially at the wild and urban interface, all these different type of values can lead to conflicts. And we posited that this conflict might be also one of the reasons why a lot of the concepts that we developed so far in terms of fire risk reduction that are well known maybe for even more than 50 years, they are not being applied till today. So the importance of looking at why these concepts have not been applied perhaps as to focus more on understanding what are these potential conflicts that specifically concentrate in the wildland-urban interface. Looking at values, there is a broad amount of literature that is calling for integrating not only social, economic, but also environmental values when we try to address risk, and in particular fire risk. Despite this wide literature that is like pressuring on this direction, the goal of trying to integrate cultural aspects in fire risk reduction is still an elusive goal and is a policy challenge that still has to be tackled if we want to go towards a direction of sustainable management. So beyond looking at really very ecological or technical knowledge, we also have to consider all these different values that play a role in defining risk. So the way when we talk about fire risk, of course, the state of the ecosystem is kind of central in this respect. There is a concept that I don't know if you are, about this concept of ecosystem services, which is defining the benefits that we receive from ecosystems. So this can be of various types. It can be provisioning services such as food, water, and timber, regulating services, so the capacity of the ecosystem to provide water regulation, cooling, climate regulation, and so on. And that can be also benefits that we derive from ecosystems that are cultural in types, for example, recreational aesthetic values. And this we suggest is a framework, as a conceptual framework that actually help to frame, to conceptualize the various interactions that happen in our case at the wildland-urban interface in terms of potential conflict with different values. So it's possible, once we have characterized these different services, to value them in biophysical, social, or economic ways, and this helps us eliciting these values, the different values, and these different trade-offs. So I have to say that the study that we started, we wanted to focus on really this social interaction that happened on the wildland-urban interface in the case of Haifa. We wanted to look about trade-offs between the cultural value of the green areas of Haifa and about the need to manage the forest to reduce fire risk. So if we want to use this framework of ecosystem services, what we happen to realize is that amongst the various classification of ecosystem services, fire regulating services was not existing. Just recently has been included in the general classification of ecosystem services. So this lead us to make a first step as an introductory study. So basically it's 3 studies that I'm presenting. One of defining fire regulating services and these services. Then we use this concept to look at the trade-offs between cultural and regulating services in the case of Haifa. And then I will spend some words about a book chapter which we call for integrating different cultures of risk at the wildland-urban interface. So as I said, the case study that is the city of Haifa, we looked in certain cases also at what happens in the Carmel area, but mainly we focused on the city, which you well know. The main characteristic of the city is that it is interspersed first by to undeveloped natural corridor or dry river beds which are unmanaged, and in these areas we have seen in 2016 they have been a threat of fire risk which have caused many damages in the city. So what is interesting in this case in Haifa is that there are all the different factors that might conflict at the wild and urban interface. We have a lot of opportunity for recreational activity and high aesthetic values of the wadis. On the other hand, there is urban development, which is really developing very close to the forest. And then we have seen that there is actually a fire risk which we thought perhaps before would come from the park, but actually developed within the city, as you know. So as I said, fire regulating services, and these services have been absent from the literature. We wanted to define them. We started from definition that is given from the Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services, which is defining fire regulating services as a reduction of the incidence of the intensity and speed of spread of fire by means of some features of the ecosystem. We also wanted to integrate a more broad definition which is taking into account not only that fires are an integral part of the ecosystem, so we don't want a system which completely excludes fires, but we want a system that avoids catastrophic fires but allows for some degrees of fires to occur. And also we want to integrate the notion that ecosystem services are not something that are out there, but they are often co-produced by human activities. So the management of the forest also is producing some services that contribute to the reduction of risk. This is perhaps not, of course, not new. It's come from the literature. We identified the type of ecosystem characteristics that are leading to fire regulating services or these services. For example, in terms of services, native and fire-adapted low biomass species and landscape heterogeneity are leading to fire regulating services, while highly flammable and high biomass and invasive species are leading instead to fire regulating these services. Our broader definition is that fire regulating services are the benefits in terms of reduction of fire intensity of magnitude, spread and avoidance of catastrophic fires. And so there are these different features that lead to reduction of risk, while these services are more what is the type of ecosystem that lead to an increase in the intensity and the spread of fire. Okay, we developed a framework. This framework is also considering that environmental management, ecosystem management is leading to an increase in ecosystem services, while ecosystem degradation is rather leading to an ecosystem disservices, so an increase of risk. We also suggested some ways of what is the benefit of defining ecosystem services and these services in this way, is that in this way we can measure ecosystem service, fire regulating services and these services in biophysical and economic terms. For example, we could integrate in models the type of vegetation and its flammability, patch size and distribution in terms of proxies that lead to a reduction of risk. On the other hand, we could also assess these fire regulating services, especially once we have assessed them in biophysical terms, in terms of like in economic terms. And there are different methods that we can use to assess this these services. For example, I avoided damage cost, which is the cost that the society would incur in the case of the fire damages are not avoided. This is not something that we did, that's something that I just wanted to show you in terms of what can be done by applying this framework. We applied this framework to the case of the city of Haifa and the Carmel region. We looked at in the literature and we looked also at expert lectures. And we identified three main periods that that present a different configuration of risk in the city of Haifa and in the Carmel region. The first one is the period of the Ottoman Empire that saw a condition like overgrazing and deforestation. Then a second period of since the end of the 19th century, where there were a lot of processes of afforestation, and the last decades of rapid urbanization and environmental conservation. That's we developed this figure just to show that according to the different drivers of land use and land management, we have different configuration of risk and different supply of ecosystem services. What can be shown from these pictures is that at the moment we find ourselves perhaps in this condition where processes of afforestation and conservation led to fire disservices and an increase in the fire risk and occurrence. And we want to find ourselves in this situation of sustainable management where fire regulating services are high, fire occurrence are lower, but we have still some degrees of human intervention. That was just the first work that we did to define these concepts. Our central work was to look at trade-offs between cultural and dysregulating services in Haifa. Why we looked at this problem, I think the potential conflict is summarized by this sentence that forest supervisor from the Jerusalem mountains as communicated in one conference. So
he still says it. Twice. Happens all the time.
Yeah, all the time. Yeah. So that's what we wanted to look at. What's the situation? What could happen in Haifa if we want to manage the forest to reduce fire risk? So, okay, well, as I said, we use this concept. We use cultural and fire regulating services to look at these trade-offs. What we did is that we interviewed users of the green areas of Haifa. We chose this particular group of persons because they were intense users of the green areas of Haifa. They knew about the whole city green areas. They were not concentrating on the natural areas that is just located close to their house. But at the end we interviewed 27 persons and we asked them to choose up to 5 areas that were interesting for them in terms of recreational activities. And then we asked them why they choose these areas, and then we also asked if should we implement any of the vegetation fuel management strategies that are generally suggested to reduce fire risk. Will this impact your experience in the green areas of Haifa? To make sure that, first we also asked fire experts to identify areas that were more at risk of fire in the city. And also to make sure that these strategies will be adapted to the urban context, we asked them if for thinning and creating buffers and fire breaks and grazing and these 5 strategies that we selected were also adapted in the case of Haifa. We used a participatory GIS approach in which we asked to map these areas. And these are the resulting maps. So these are the areas in Haifa that are intensely visited by urban dwellers, at least those that we interviewed. For example, this is Wadi Lotem, this is Wadi Siach, and all the others are also areas that are, this is Wadi Ziv, this is Givat Aizim, and we included also the beaches because there is a lot of concentration of cultural interest. There is less risk of fire, but it's an important part in the city. And then we derived this fire risk map and locating some areas that are particular fire risk are more concentrated in the north of the city. Besides that, we collected also a lot of information of why people visit these areas. Actually, we have a lot of material on that, but mainly the fact of being in nature and being able to feel this sense of wilderness so close to home was one of the main reasons that people will cherish these areas. The accessibility, not needing to drive a car, the good opportunities to observing wildlife and so on make the importance of these green areas for city inhabitants. We developed, that was to say that we gather a lot of other information that are accessible also in other studies. We developed this map of trade-offs. There are some areas that are more in which the recreational value is higher than the risk. For example, as I said, in Wadi Lotem and Wadi Siach. But there are other areas where the fire fuel management should be prevalent with respect to the cultural value of the. When we looked at fire management strategies, for these graphs are showing what green areas of users are valuing and were deemed as accepting as fire management strategies. For example, grazing was something that was the most acceptable strategies for the people to see happening in these areas, while fire breaks will very much be opposed by the users of the green areas. When we asked to fire experts, most of the strategies were seen as acceptable, although in certain conditions, and maybe there was uncertainty with respect to using fire breaks and buffers to reduce fire risk, that will be not the best strategies to adopt in Haifa, as the fire is jumping from one area to the other, and fire breaks will not be effective, besides the fact that they will disrupt the aesthetic value of the landscape very much. We summarized a little bit this different perspective in this table. We see that perhaps there will be especially a conflict for, in the case of thinning. What resulted in our interviews is that people really value the kind of what they call natural aspects of the green areas. So seeing some anthropogenic elements introduced in these areas will really affect their their experience, there could be some agreement between the two communities in terms of that fire breaks will really not be the way to go in the case of Haifa. But other conflict might arise also in seeing pine trees removed, as they feel, inhabitants feel that these are part of the landscape today. I think one important part of our study was not only to identify some potential conflicts, but also to find synergies. So, for example, thinning was accepted in a way for some of the respondents in the term that it can improve the view on the landscape. Creating buffers around the urban areas might be opportunities to have expand networks of trails and areas for picnic around the city. Removing pine trees, some could see it as restoring like a more natural environment, because some of the respondents were aware that pine trees are not a species that will be found as oaks. They will see more like oaks and other tall trees that would provide some shade. Another way of finding synergies and avoiding this concept is through some technological solution. For example, putting smokes and fire heat detector could be a solution in this peri-urban context to avoid cutting trees. So it's like in the end, some of the conclusion of our study is that these dialogues that started taking place in our study allow it to find some synergies, and it's very important that it take place if you want to avoid some conflicts. And that also on the wildland-urban interface, we, coming from the environmental field, we have a tendency to look at systems as social ecological systems, and forgetting that the technological component in urban system is very important, and we should integrate this to deal with fire risk and the wildland-urban interface. So finally, during our interviews, especially with fire experts, and also looking at some lectures given during symposium in the aftermath of the 2016 fire, and then also looking into the literature that is available when we deal with fire and the wildland-urban interface, is that there are mainly two cultures of risk, fire risk. One that is developed more to deal with fire in the open forest, and one that is more designed to deal with fire in the urban context. And if we want to deal with fire at the wildland-urban interface, these two different ways of dealing with fire have to come together in a new paradigm, in a new way of dealing with fires, which is a combination of dealing with fire in the open forest and dealing with fire in the urban context, but is also different. We have seen in the context of Haifa that some of the strategies that are suitable in the open forest, they are not adapted to the wildland-urban interface. For example, we should avoid fire breaks. Buffers might be important. There are all a series of strategies that are relevant in this context and that are not they are different than what we are used to. For example, with dealing with fire in the Carmel area.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Can you go back? What do you mean about fire breaks? What do you call fire breaks?
Like areas that are the vegetation has been cut.
Cut off totally?
Yes.
For how long?
At least.
Sorry?
it depends. Like
70 meters.
70 meters.
Okay. So, and buffers is something more.
what I call buffer is around the urban,
Yeah.
really at the
Okay.
boundary. That I made this difference because it was.
Yeah, it's good.
But still it will require that the vegetation is cut completely at least in the first 10-20 meters
It's
and
okay.
then
That's what we do.
yeah, okay. Okay, this study we also looked into the literature. We identified many different ways of adapting to fires at the wild and urban interface. It's a book chapter that it's in review. One of the things is that we have to look at to bring together these two communities, which are mainly concentrating on some of the components of the framework, but not seeing them together. What are the advantages of seeing coming in an holistic view is that we can increase the efficiency of any different strategies, perhaps also the cost effectiveness, avoiding conflict, enhancing conservation and sustainability. So it's really what we suggest is to bring these two different type of just to finish, just to conclude, these strategies that we are suggesting requires first of all to identify these different values. We did it in our study where we looked at trade-offs between cultural and regulating services. It also needs to merge different cultures of risk and that are now represented by different communities. And it's on fashion now in the moment to talk about ecosystem-based approaches. And this, at least what they call it for is multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral approaches. So it's worth like taking this into considerations. Besides looking at trade-offs in our study, we've identified also a lot of synergies that can be valued if we want to address and to have the implementation of these strategies being successful, because today, even if we have a lot of, as I said, available knowledge, this has not been really implemented so far. And then, yes, perhaps for more ecologists, in terms of, instead of looking at social ecological system, we should look at social ecological and technological system if we want to reduce risk. The way forward, we hope that with our studies we put some basis to further assess fire regulating services in biophysical but also in economic terms. And of course I stress that because valuing how much ecosystem management is providing in terms of reduction of risk is an important dimension that perhaps is not taken into account now. The ecosystem services concept is specifically designed to bring into the socio-economics perspective in the management of ecosystems. Again, improve our identification of synergies. There are a lot of opportunities to see not conflict but common interest, and also develop a fire culture at the wildland urban interface, which is distinct from the two different culture that we are used to today. This work, some has been published already and some is in review. These are the references, and yeah, thank you.
So can we open this up for discussion? We actually have policymakers and practitioners who are here and could probably be beneficial. Moti.
First of all, I would like once again to apologize for being late. Thank you for an interesting presentation. I have two technical questions actually. The first relates to, I think, slide number 11, where you have presented the number of houses or buildings or structures that were damaged or burned during the fire in 2016. And I just wanted to ask, what is the source of this?
Okay, the source, if I remember correct, it must be published on newspaper.
Meaning that...
I can provide you because it's in the paper, but
sure, I would be more than happy to read the published paper, those that were published and those that are expected to be published. And the second one is also a technical question. I think it was around slide number 29 or 28, which you have showed areas that are prone to fires or areas that are under risk to fire. And I was wondering what... Yeah, this one.
This one?
I was wondering what was the methodology or the source for this slide.
Yeah, this we asked fire experts to find
Could you clarify who are fire experts?
So we're a policymaker,
Okay.
independent experts.
Firefighters?
Not
Are
firefighters.
they anonymous, or did they give permission to tell their names? I don't remember.
No, they were anonymous.
Okay, sorry.
It doesn't...
Were they local?
Academics, yes, local and national, like
Okay.
are also independent experts, but or also people
Consultants?
working for forest management in this.
Including from the locale, from Haifa?
Yeah. So we interviewed 13 of them. We asked them to point us areas that would be particularly at risk from fire, mainly thinking about the vegetation, but let's say that the main factors that were considered were the slope of the body, the green area, the vegetation, the
Climate?
vicinity, the wind direction,
When? Okay.
and the location of the houses with respect to the slope.
Mm.
See,
So, I
Because-
mean, this it's only indicative. It's not like we could develop a map based on these factors that takes into account the vegetation, and we didn't have like detailed layers about.
exactly.
like,
This is a very valuable map, because I see those polygons. Let's say the polygons on the upper left, right. They are quite sharp, meaning that they were just maybe an arbitrary presentation of an area. It's not like that it follows or delineates some kind of topographic slopes or areas or something like that.
It's indicative. It's not indicative.
It is indicative, exactly.
Yes, we wanted to build indicatively because we didn't have the layers. I think in Jerusalem they built a map. At least I didn't have, but about with the right layers to actually estimate the fire risk according to the factors that these were like more qualitative based on the experience. We still can see that there are areas that are in the north of the city that are considered more at risk. Our objective was to build this map in the end to look that there are areas that we should of course prioritize fire management. There are other areas that if we looked managing the forest, we should also take into account that these are very visited areas in which these synergies that we identified should be concretized in the planning, and there are other areas where they are at high risk and high recreational value, and that in these areas which are in yellow, which are not so many, but you might have to really try to find synergies.
What do you mean by trade-offs?
Trade-offs, when we look at how the city, the urban, the users of the green areas were accepting or not accepting intervention in the forest, this might generate trade-offs with our goal of managing the forest to reduce risk. For example,
So it's
green
addressing
thinning,
the conflicts and
Yes. Trade-offs between what people value in the forest, let's say like tall trees, shade, sense of wilderness. What people really valued is like I don't need to take the car, I walk 2 minutes from home.
Right.
It's I feel I'm in the wilderness. I forget I'm in the city.
So those are the values
Yes.
that okay.
And should we manage these areas to reduce risk? For example, should we do thinning, remove some pine trees, which
Right.
might significantly reduce risk according to some experts? That will be the most cost-effective strategies to implement. People there feel attached to the landscape,
Right.
even if it's not natural. So.
Right, so those are the conflicts, but what's the trade-off? I mean, just
Yeah,
Do you want me to take it?
no, I think it's the same thing, like trade-offs.
No,
because it's
in the ecosystem services assessment literature, when you have a land use policy that implements something to raise the value of something like more agriculture or more timber,
Yeah.
then the trade-off is what you're losing in other types
Okay.
of values, like cultural values in this case, or
Okay.
regulation values. So you want to try to avoid trade-offs and encourage synergies where you don't lose the cultural value when you implement your fire policies. Does that make sense?
yeah,
It
that
does.
does make sense.
It does.
That makes sense.
That's
So,
Can I ask one more question? I mean, this is just in terms of understanding the terminology. So, at one point it was, we reduce the conflict, we look more for commonalities. But sometimes if you look specifically at the conflicts, which you've already, thinning of the, either replacing pine trees with oak trees or something like that, have you looked at different priorities? I mean, sometimes you can't ignore you can't just look at the commonalities, and sometimes you get actually very good results by addressing conflict on the assumption that the different stakeholders have different priorities. Something is more important to them than something else. I mean, height might be more important, or whatever the element is. By looking actually at the differences, you might be able to identify or prioritize those differences, and then you might be able to look at trade-offs in a positive, not in this, that's why I was confused, not in the sense that Danny described, which is negative, but in terms of being able to negotiate some solutions.
well, I think that's most what it was not like a primary goal of our study, but
Mhm.
it came up because it's
Right,
kind of
okay.
the discussion that took place in the
Mm-hmm.
with So there are some. This I think it's like a perhaps the most important thing. Actually, you're
Yeah.
right. Like how to find. Well, first there are a lot of information that we gather from our interviews about qualitative information. Since not only about people like grazing, we know about the details of also their fear of having grazing. For example, you have to. In urban context might generate also a lot of negative outcomes, but while we were talking we could find that there are strategies that actually could even improve the experience in these areas. The view from the wadis of Haifa is highly valued. In some cases is really amazing. Having feeling could improve in certain points the views on the sea and on these other areas. Creating buffers could also provide some additional opportunities for easy walking just outside the house and other areas for picnicking. So these are also not coming from fire experts, they're coming also from the users of the green areas.
It's understanding the interests on both sides and,
Yes.
and addressing them.
In fact, one of the question is how much ecological knowledge was behind also the person that we interviewed might generate shifts towards finding more like synergies. So it was not in our aim to assess that, but of course it could appear when we talked about pine trees, for example, when more people were aware that pine trees might yes be part of the landscape now, but they were not always so.
Right,
It
they're
was
not native.
easier to see a landscape with yes oak trees or other type of trees. But I have to say that also not looking only, but also the technological component is so important because it kind of like level down trade-offs that might arise from cutting too many trees or so on. So yeah, it was one good outcome of the study as well.
It's an interesting question also because it emphasizes where you want to invest your money. If you assume that you have a limited amount of funding and you want to take it into this either ecosystem management direction or technological direction, and where the greatest benefit is relative to the cost, the social cost. I think, but we haven't gotten that far yet to make that comparison.
No, I think it's like next
And
we are
that's the next study.
yes, actually I'm working with he's an economist more, Andrea Germandi from the Natural Resources Management.
Andres.
So we are participating in a call for a EU project in which we more think about how to value these services also in economic terms, not because it's the ultimate value, but because knowing how much it's worth managing the forest to reduce risk in terms of avoided costs and replacement costs could be also kind of like a good additional motive and generally accepted language to promote this type of interventions, let's say.
Following Danny's comment, I just wanted to ask that. Let's say you were interviewing those people just shortly after a fire. Do you think that
I thought about that today.
in terms of decision making and the exact point where they were made, do you think that the trade-off map will change dramatically?
Well, it's
I was just proofreading this and I just thought of exactly that question. That we interviewed people 1 year after the fire.
yeah, it can, but honestly I'm aware about situations in the Carmel where people were affected by the fire and they were asked to clear trees around their house and opposed that, even if they were affected by it.
Yeah, but once there's been a while since the fire, the impact or the influence is fading away gradually. So the people's opinion shortly after the event might be extremely different than, let's say, a year after, 2 years after, and so on.
Encourage them to put part of the Carmel again in fire and have empirical, fresh results.
Obviously, this is only just a hypothetical.
It's theoretical kind of.
Of course.
You don't consider it done.
I remember being in a Tivon. There was a map of how much different localities had to, from Cacao, had to thin the vegetation. And I listened to a group of residents from Tivon, which is a high-risk community. I mean, it's basically built within the... And the opposition was so extreme. You know, it wasn't even... Well, I think that the recommendation was like a 90% reduction. I mean, the recommendation was also quite starting it with 90%, but the community reaction was quite extreme.
Yeah.
Keren Kayemet reports that sometimes when they try to thin forests that are too near to settlements, rural settlements, the neighbors attack the workers there. They were furious that nobody asked them. It's our forest, they said.
Yeah, actually that's also what a little bit came up from this. One part of the study was like, are these values like drivers of risk? Really, because just often I had the reply, but will you even cut down and only, or the priority was, are you going to harm in any way or destabilize the ecosystem there? This is what, so no economic consideration, no social impact, but no, this most important thing is that we can still keep seeing wildlife here, that in any way, and for some of the respondents, an ecological health will mean not touching at all the forest at all.
Yeah.
I spent December working on an article on the cultural ecosystem services of Mediterranean pine forests. And if I could conclude everything that I learned in one sentence, I would say people in the Mediterranean basin, not just Israel, but everywhere around the basin, love pine forests until they learn not to. Because it's an ephemeral phenomenon. It depends who you are and where you are. It doesn't change overnight. It changes over periods of decades, but it's all historically contextual. Like, and compared to what? What's the alternative was also really important. But here I would imagine that, and we didn't discuss this yet, but part of that bridging is educational, which we didn't talk about at all, about showing this threat to people and what they're really faced with, as if the fire didn't do it
Are there any
itself.
studies that focus on communicating? On
No, there are a lot. Like there are a lot of studies that assess exactly this point. Also, look at how much time is passed after fire, comparing communities that are affected by a fire, they are not affected by a fire, their acceptance of the intervention.
the effectiveness of communication strategies would also be.
But the stakeholders are totally different in their views. Fire experts or forest specialists and communities, they don't agree about one policy.
So we're
Oh,
actually
you're
going to
saying
have a
within the
workshop next
policy
year.
community?
Yeah,
Within
I
the
think
policy community, they don't agree amongst themselves?
I don't think so. It's divergent.
There were
They have
some.
different views.
There were different views actually amongst the experts as well.
Yeah.
Of course, amongst experts and also amongst users, there were
Users,
different
yeah.
views. According,
Yeah.
a lot of people told me, some people, I studied this at school. I know that, so they will step back and maybe allow something to happen because of the knowledge, of course, that they have.
Yeah.
So there are two. One, there's some work of Larry Susskind where he works with coastal communities. I can send you he published a book on it, but where he works with, it is coastal communities post hurricane or post whatever, but he works with them on these trade-offs.
Mhm.
Again, trade-offs in my vocabulary, so that it's not the same trade-offs that yours were, but on bridging the different the value conflicts, etc., which might be interesting. And he uses a lot of role play in those things. And the other thing is that in March we're planning to have another. The Emergency Center does a course each year. The first year was on risk assessment. The second year was on on trauma post.
That's what you work on, right?
No,
Post trauma.
no, it's not what Michal works on. But no, she's the planner.
Sorry.
But I mean, and this third one is going to be using fire as a way as a community modeling tool. So it might be interesting to you I'll send you the proposal. It might be interesting to you people to take part in it. But how these decisions can be made in a certain type of participatory modeling tool, and fires will be what will be. So we should make sure that we have the names of everybody here.
Is there few enough people that we can hear who is here?
Yes,
Do you
let's
mind?
introduce.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm preparing for the big storm for tomorrow.
Still working for it, yes.
I'm Yaella Depietri, head of urban infrastructure.
What's your name?
Yaella Depietri
Okay.
in Haifa municipality.
כן, נפגשנו. אני זוכר, היא פה, בהרצאה על שירותי מערכת של הכרמל.
יפה בדיוק. אז אני חשבתי שאנחנו משהו דומה כזה, וזה הערכה.
לא, זה עבודה אחרת.
כן, הבנתי. כדי.
My name is Yair Zilberman and I am the head of security routine and emergency preparedness for the city.
Leonid Reznik, I'm the head of emergency preparedness department.
Work together.
Smuti Zohar from this university at the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. And I'm interested in natural hazards, mainly in the past, but not only.
Same. I just have different name, but my interest is the same. I'm Norit Kliot and I'm Professor Emeritus in the Geography Department.
I'm Deborah Shmoyli and I'm in the same department. And Michal Ben-Gal.
Yeah.
I'm the coordinator of the center, and I also graduated in the geography department, and I did my PhD also with Deborah.
And worked on conflicts.
Environmental conflict and planning.
Environmental conflicts and planning.
I'm also a lawyer, but this is a different issue.
That was to get to know the enemy.
So,
Not active.
I'm taking a little bit of a risk here, but was there anything in here that was interesting or instructive or anything that contributes any new knowledge to what you already do? I'm sorry, I'm taking a risk by you saying no, but...
Just strengthen my opinion in what we're doing in Haifa. No please go back to the
To the map.
map, to the
Red and green.
red
Yeah.
and green. Yes, it's
Where?
important for us to combine these two maps
Where's
together.
the yellow?
Sorry?
And
Now go back to the map.
No,
Uh,
The combined map.
The combined one.
זו שיש בטורקיז.
That one, yes.
זהו.
This one is very important for us because from this map
High cultural, low
can
risk
create
is green,
Okay.
priority.
and high risk, low cultural is red.
To do
That means you
Right.
do your fire
What's
management.
what you
Yellow though.
said what to do and what not to do
It's
is
high
also
in both.
important for us.
So your major focus would be on the yellow part of that map,
Yeah,
which is
Small.
very small.
Well,
It sounds, I would expect it to be larger.
let's say
it'll be very interesting to know that if I will do something, maybe the high culture would be higher.
right, it can
Yeah.
can change.
It can change.
Well, this also I have to depends on the
We're missing, we didn't interview the neighbors who live in those red areas.
Very interesting.
We,
Yeah.
so they might have something to say about
Yes.
this.
Yes, because
I'm
if-
sure they do.
If I do something
Yeah.
in high risk and low cultural areas, the red areas,
Mhm.
I will do something and make these areas more interesting to the neighbors,
Yeah.
Mhm.
like bike roads and etc.
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah.
Then it will be very important for us to take this decision.
יכול לעשות שם focus groups.
Yeah.
That you can have simultaneous
Okay.
implementation of fire regulation policies
Yeah.
with
נכון.
more cultural
Cultural
activities.
בדיוק. בדיוק.
like we did in חורשת שזר דקר או אידר, חורשה ואידר.
Mhm.
yes, because most of the people said this is what makes Haifa, you know that.
Unique, yeah.
Unique.
We don't want to move to
Eliminate
Modi'in, or and when they mention other places where, of course, I mean, this is really a resource for the city.
Yeah.
That and yeah, there are many ways I think to build on finding higher value in both
Right.
senses. It's not a minor. These things of the values. Sorry for. It's not a minor. It can really, in my opinion, generate conflicts if it's not addressed in the
Yeah, but I need to manage the risks, right?
right.
So I have to go to the red areas.
Mhm.
And to do something.
But
Synergy.
yeah, but in these areas, if I do something and I'll make benefits to the neighbors, then I go to these areas first place, not second place and third place,
Mm-hmm.
to make this priority.
In Jerusalem corridor, there were a few fires that afterwards the settlers, מושב ומושב שיתופי, were asked if they want to remove the vegetation
Okay.
from the fence that's around it. The issue was fenced. And all of them said immediately after the fire,
Of course not.
no, thank you. We don't want you to do anything to
They like their nature.
our bush, our forest.
Though it's dangerous.
Obviously,
And that was right after.
Obviously, yes.
people like to see green.
Yeah, they like to see green. They don't like to see fires,
Yes.
but they still don't like to have what you call trade-off.
I have
If this is what you want, no, thank you.
I have a good friend who's a fire historian in California, and his personal vendetta are people who build their homes in forested areas and then expect the public to expend its resources and its firefighters
Yes.
protecting homes that they don't
Yes.
spend most of their time.
Yes.
But
yes,
what he
yes,
says
yes.
is that these people who refuse to allow public agencies to take care of the forest be held legally responsible for their own well-being, that their
I-
insurance shouldn't cover their
I
losses.
think he's right. I think he's right.
Right.
Very interesting.
Ellie is my colleague. However, both of us, each one of us has a different role. He has to prevent and I have to evacuate people when it happens. So we're familiar with the red areas. I'm not sure with all of them. That one on the part, no, before them, that red one, what one,
This, no.
above.
This.
This is
This one.
Padilotem.
This is Lotem. This
What
is
is the red one?
Achuzas? No.
Huza.
No.
Sheikh.
No, no.
Sheikh.
It's between Kababir
Yeah.
and
Okay.
Anasi.
So we're familiar with all these valleys, and because they are very dangerous, it depends on the winds. If it's, let's say, if it's an eastern winds, it would be better for that area. If it be on the opposite side from the west,
Mm-hmm.
then it become more dangerous. We improve the way of how to evacuate more
Mhm.
people in a more efficient way, and that's what we took from or learned from 2016.
Mm.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I think maybe it was more interesting this part because of the two different ways of, on one hand adapted to the urban context, and the other is a problem that is at the interface of two ways of dealing with fire.
Yes.
We have to combine perhaps also how thinking about lowering what we spend in a way to increase it in the other, like find a
Done.
balance perhaps,
תן לי
because
רגע את הפנקה שלך.
that's what I see perhaps that might be useful.
However, you mentioned during the lecture that the fire went from one side of the street to the other side. So we were there, and it was amazing, and it was like a nightmare. You see, and when you saw the when,
Shot to 200 meters.
Sovalim,
Pine cones.
the pine cones, they just moved. They were like grenades
Yeah.
from
Mhm.
one side to
Burst.
the other side of the street, and you cannot avoid it. So it 70 meter, 80 meter, 50 meters. I'm not sure that it will be enough in high winds.
But
Mhm.
in places that we did not barriers, how do you call it, buffers,
Mhm.
like in Ramat Sapir, the houses did get burned.
Mhm.
So it decreased the intensity of the fire and the volume of the
So it
fire.
was 20 meters
And-
buffer zone. 20?
No, 10 to 20 meters. That's
Okay.
what we do. But I have another problem with the map of the risks. You didn't. You only. Can onto Haifa to the border, and it's not correct because the fire could come outside of Haifa.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so you need to include these areas, high risk areas, although they are outside of Haifa.
Right.
If you will
Well,
speak, sorry. If you will speak with the mayor of Nesher, he would say that even a missile hitting will create a big fire, and then it moves from Nesher to Haifa and university and all over. Yes,
This
that
area, this area, this
Mhm.
area.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's we have some of areas. This is clipped to the boundaries of the city. But in truth, also, if we see this map, most of the experts looked at these areas which are closer to the park, and that's where the forest is more dense. That's areas that have not been burned before, and of course, that's for what you said also before. One expert said that the most effective thing to do will be cutting down, like the pine trees, and perhaps also ask people to understand that like if you really want to put the money on something that is more effective, I mean you know it better than me, but and on the other hand, if because this might generate conflicts, that you might also have to campaign around the fact that but of course we focus only on Haifa also because we have other studies on the Carmel which are looking at different, not with us but with colleagues, and we wanted to look just at Haifa, but of course it's connected with the park, so
The boundaries, they don't.
They don't
They don't recognize
the
the municipal boundaries.
no.
No,
Should be re-educated, should be.
In the past we used to make the buffer zone around the city, nearby the Carmel forest. After 2016, we realized that we should do it inside the city, and near the neighborhood as well, because I didn't figure out that kind of a fire could occur in the city and just move from one neighborhood to the other. So now it's not on the boundaries, but inside the neighborhoods as well. So.
It's harder to deal with inside the city.
And it costs much and much more. And Ellie needs to deal with it.
But in fact, one of the reviewers of our paper, it's a little bit of not really unique, but the particular situation of Haifa. We said, how come this is a wildland-urban interface if you have areas that are inside the cities, but these wadis are like undeveloped forests, and you can really see the same dynamics of wildland-urban interface kind of areas, but they are inside the city. It's not many cities that have this configuration.
Yes. So this is what's unique. And it's very unique and very challenging and dangerous as well. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.